Welcome back to another episode of Girls Know Nothing. Today's guest is Ruth Davison, and Ruth is the Chief Executive Officer at Refuge. Ruth has over 15 years' experience in the voluntary sector, including complex fundraising programs and increasing the income of charity organisations. Ruth has mainly focused on working in charities that specialise in international development, social justice and the environment. For those of you that don't know, I have been an ambassador to Refuge for almost coming up to a year now. And for those that don't know, Refuge is the biggest domestic abuse charity in the UK. On any given day, the organisation supports thousands of women, helping them to overcome physical, emotional and financial as well as logistical impacts of abuse to help rebuild their lives. 1 in 4 women in the UK will experience domestic abuse in her lifetime. And for every 30 seconds, the police receive a call for help relating to domestic abuse. Thousands of women and children are supported by Refuge on any given day. Welcome to the studio, Ruth. Obviously, I've talked a little bit about our connection and the work that I have done with Refuge, but for the listeners that don't necessarily know what Refuge is or does, can you tell us a little bit about what your core mission is?
Sure. So Refuge is the largest specialist charity supporting women and their children who experience domestic abuse here in this country. So our real mission is to end domestic abuse, to stop it being tolerated in society. But day to day, we deal with the epidemic of domestic abuse that is affecting us. 1 in 4 women here in the UK will be affected in their lifetime. So we are first and foremost a frontline service providing charity.
You talked a little bit about the day-to-day services that charity provides, but what day-to-day does your role look like in Refuge?
I have one of the most amazing jobs in the world. I always wanted to work in the voluntary sector so that I could do something with meaning and purpose. And I'm very lucky that I get to take all that expertise and insight from my frontline colleagues and then convert that into advocacy, public campaigning, awareness raising. I also have to manage a brilliant senior leadership team, but they're so excellent that that is also a joy. So a combination of internal work running the charity and then external work, trying to shift perspectives in society through conversations like this.
It's really nice to have people on the podcast that actually enjoy their jobs, because quite a lot of the time on the internet you hear people moan about their jobs instead of talking about the joyful parts of their job. Obviously, I will go on to a little bit more about the campaigns that Refuge have on at the moment and the ones that I've been very fortunate to be a part of. But I did a little bit of internet stalking on you. Sorry if you got the little notification of just me popping up every 5 minutes, but I've seen you've worked in the voluntary and charity sector for quite a lot of your career. What kind of inspired you to want to pursue this?
Yeah, it's so ingrained within me. I find that quite hard to answer. My mum was a nurse and she worked early in her career, one of the first nurses who was providing terminal care for people who were dying of AIDS during the HIV and AIDS epidemic in the 80s. And I think probably that instilled in me a desire to do something with my life that was meaningful. That's probably why I love my job. But don't be under any illusions. It's really hard work. Working on the front lines of domestic abuse is traumatic. But you know, ultimately at the end of each day that you've done something with some meaning. And sometimes we have big campaign wins. It's great the work that we do with you. And sometimes we have tiny wins. And sometimes one woman will reach out to us and we know we're the only people that she will have spoken to. And all of that provides so much kind of joy and reward and reflects, I guess, my values and who I want to be as a person. That's why I entered the sector and why I get so much joy from the job I do now.
And briefly off camera, we talked a little bit about what it's like to work in the voluntary sector, and especially when it's closer towards violence against women and girls and about compassion fatigue. Do you find that sometimes in your job you do experience that as a result of the things that you do see?
I think often I feel quite angry and I try and galvanise that anger into action. I understand there's so much that we all have to care about and worry about in our day-to-day personal lives and in society and in the world. And it's difficult to find the headspace and heart space to care about everything. But I find it really distressing how little attention is paid to violence against women and girls when 2 women a week, every single week, will lose their lives to their former or current partner. And yet it's very rare those stories make the headlines. And if they make the headlines, it's rare they'll stay there for more than a few days. And I think there's so much that needs to change in how we think about violence against women and girls and misogyny in society that, yeah, I'm worried that compassion fatigue and not caring enough really makes our lives and jobs much more difficult.
I do think as well, when we talk about women that have fallen victims to forms of domestic abuse, there is a Twitter account that I do follow that puts the names and stories up of women that have unfortunately experienced some kind of violence and didn't make a headline. And when you see the grand scale of what actually happens behind closed doors, it is really upsetting, but it's also kind of upsetting in a way to see how media does portray victims as well. Is that something that you find is a big struggle when working with Refuge?
Oh my goodness, yes. The kind of victim blaming in relation to violence against women and girls is so prevalent and obvious. Just this week, there was an article from the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, Nicole Jacobs, calling that out. You know, we saw the tragic murder of the head teacher at Epsom College and her daughter by her husband. But the headline was all about how her kind of successful career emasculated him. You wouldn't see that story in reverse. Again, a very recent terrible story, not connected to domestic abuse, but Nicola Bulley's tragic death. That was reported on, and we heard details about her health, you know, her relationship with alcohol. Again, why would that be relevant to the fact that she was a missing person and there was an urgent investigation to try and find her? So I think we just accept and normalise that this is how these stories are reported, and yet it reinforces stereotypes and it reinforces very harmful misogynistic attitudes.
Yeah, I think it's kind of mind-blowing for me. Obviously, when I was younger and I was seeing these things, it just kind of became normalised and became desensitised to it. But now I'm who I am now and I've woken up to it. I've never once seen an article written about a male victim in the same way as we see how female victims are put on trial essentially for being victims. And I guess that's one of the reasons why I wanted to be wanted to work closely with Refuge. And we work very closely on the online safety bill. So for those people that don't know what the online safety bill is, do you want to give a bit of a breakdown?
So the online safety bill is a piece of legislation. It's currently making its way through the Lords and will hopefully become law in the next few months. It will be the first bill of its kind, the first piece of legislation of its kind anywhere in the world to try and regulate the online environment, you know, a space that all of us spend time in. And that's a huge opportunity when looking at that regulation and when holding the tech companies to account, to look at how do we hold them to account and regulate to protect women and girls online.
Why did Refuge become involved in online safety bill campaigning?
Yeah, in 2017, Refuge set up the UK's first and still the UK's only specialist tech facilitated abuse team. And we did that because my colleagues on the front line were hearing increasing numbers of stories about tech being used as part of the abuse that a woman was experiencing. Whether that was maybe where people's heads jumped to immediately, you know, being trolled or kind of really unpleasant comments online, whether that was hacking into her account, whether that was cyber stalking. And I noticed you said you cyber stalked me earlier.
Sorry.
It's okay. Or whether it's far more sinister, you know, the use of malware and spyware to track a woman. This online abuse is interconnected with offline abuse. All abuse is a pattern of behaviour. It's highly dangerous. And yet we still have the only specialist frontline team working on it. And we felt we can't just keep trying to meet the growing demand. And it's exponentially growing, the demand for that team's services, as tech abuse becomes more complicated and more prevalent. We had to also try and stem the problem upstream. We had to look at where are the solutions that can stop this happening to so many women and destroying so many people's lives.
I think there is a problem and there's a massive misconception of domestic abuse is that it is only physical. And people forget that, unfortunately, with the way that technology is moving, even if you've physically left your perpetrator, they still have some onus of control over you. What does your specialist tech unit help support victims with specifically?
Yeah, so we'll work with the most complex cases, the most dangerous cases. If all of your devices and perhaps also the Internet of Things within your home, if all of them have been compromised, it's very hard to know how to solve that yourself. It's dangerous to go online to look for advice. It's dangerous maybe even to call or message anyone for help. So our team will work with you to clean your devices, to make them safe again, to replace them if necessary, and to guide you through that process. We also do publish on our tech safety website some more basic advice for people who are experiencing perhaps lower level, less complex tech abuse, how to change passwords, the kinds of stuff that you might expect, and how to kind of get your devices clear and see if anyone might have infiltrated them. So our team really are reserved for the very complex, highly dangerous cases.
It's we staged a little bit of I want to say a protest, not the right word, but when the online safety bill returned to Parliament, to show parliamentarians how many women actually face online abuse daily. And I can't remember the exact number, but it was just the sheer number of women that walked through Westminster that one day that would experience abuse is insane. And when you can translate it to the rest of the UK, people forget that it's not just the normal stuff like controlling money. But, I'm a single woman. I'm not with a partner, but I experience a huge array of online abuse. And I know a lot of people that do listen and people that have reached out to me as well experience it. It's hard to know what to do if it's not coming from a partner, or where to be able to seek help from. And I don't know if this is ever something you'd be able to talk about, but what would be the best advice for anybody that's kind of experiencing that level of harassment online?
Yeah, it's really difficult. And unfortunately, the main advice that women are still given, and I'm sure people give it to you as well, just delete your account, love, or, just stop tweeting. Don't put yourself out there so much. And I think Refuge is outraged, really, whether it's a partner, a former partner, or a stranger. None of us should be forced off online spaces. So you can look at our tech safety website. That would have useful tips. We also did a brilliant project with Avast, which was about a digital breakup. So if you've been in contact with someone and communication with someone and you want to make sure you have a clean digital breakup and can move away from them, protecting yourself, you can do that. But I think you're right. What you're talking to is the just day-to-day trolling and abuse that you will get from complete strangers who have no reason really to harm you other than that they can. And I think that speaks to the widespread misogyny in our society, that people feel able to do that. I know it's not just against women and girls. I know all sorts of people will experience this kind of online hate and silencing and being forced off these platforms. And it's just utterly unacceptable. The Online Safety Bill is a chance to really change that for all sorts of groups who need special protection, including women and girls.
Have you, as Refuge, seen an increase in demand since we've seen an increase in misogyny influences taking place online?
Yeah, it's hard to draw a direct parallel, but there is no doubt that the very, very influential, widespread misogyny influencers, as you kindly call them, are making a lot of money and are fundamentally shifting attitudes of young people, particularly younger boys in school. And that is very dangerous, I think. We've been around for 50 years as Refuge. We don't want to exist. I don't want to do this job as much as I enjoy it. I would much rather that Refuge isn't needed. And yet we're seeing misogynistic attitudes actually accelerate and expand and grow. And that is a result of online influencing.
So as a result of kind of what we've seen directly targeting towards women and girls, obviously Refuge is a massive campaigner in putting violence against women and girls code of practice into the online safety bill. What does that actually mean for potential victims or for female users online?
You're doing my job for me. You really are a very good campaigner on this. I think, we are calling for a code of practice. You're right. And that's specific guidance that we've written with other charities, other specialists to say, what would you need to do? And it looks at everything step by step. Safety by design, when you create these platforms, how do you make sure that they're inherently safe, which isn't a consideration anyone has at the moment, right the way through to how do you respond when someone is abused. So at the moment, for example, you can't report and flag domestic abuse as the cause of the abuse you're receiving. It's just not a tick box. So you can't indicate this is likely to be part of a pattern rather than a one-off incident, or it's not just this one comment or photo that I've put up that's drawing attention. It's a specific perpetrator who is relentlessly targeting me, perhaps through multiple accounts. That would be incredibly useful, as well as basics around commitments to, fast turnarounds and responses to women who can often wait for months and months for an answer or hear nothing, which only demoralises and re-traumatises them. So our code of practice would be a step-by-step guide, really, through everything from how you set the platform and products up to how you train the staff and how you respond when something goes wrong.
I know there's a lot of people that are very against the bill in general, and it's been very challenging to get this code of practice to be taken seriously by parliamentarians. What do you think is the biggest reason they don't want to support this?
Yeah, I've had a lot of arguments around freedom of speech. We should be able to do what we want, and anything that curtails freedom of speech is deeply worrying. And I think that's why we've lost what could have been a really helpful part of the bill around legal but harmful content. However, that said, the code of practice could work, and more crimes against women and girls have been included in priority crimes now as the legislation's developed. So I think this is a first step, isn't it? This is the first attempt by any country in the world, anywhere, to regulate the online space. If it's only regulating what is illegal content, it's not far enough, but it is a first step. And hopefully that allays the fears of those who worry that their freedoms are curtailed unnecessarily.
I think it's one thing that's really hard is that the internet is, like, I remember when I first got into the internet, it was dial-up and you could play games for like 15 minutes before the internet basically crashed. But now it is such a big thing and it's part of our everyday lives. That realistically, do you ever think we're ever going to be safe 100% online?
I think the reality for all women and girls and many, many people is that no, we're not completely safe. You probably make risk assessments all the time in the real world and online. You know, are you carrying your keys when you walk home so you can get into the house that bit quicker? Are you going to take that alleyway or walk through the park, or are you going to walk a longer route down a main road? We are used to, as women and girls, having to think about how do we keep ourselves safe all the time. And the online space is no different. So I guess depressingly, my answer is no, but that doesn't mean that we should put in as many safeguards as possible. You know, street lights, police on the streets. We need those kinds of measures, not exactly those, but we need those kinds of safety measures in the online space as well, just to take down the risk level.
I think if there's anyone that is particularly listening to this episode that doesn't really necessarily believe in the online safety bill because of freedom of speech, if they haven't heard me talk in the House of Lords briefing event, I said to you guys and peers that were in the briefing that one of the things that I'm very concerned about is if we don't implement this code of practice quick enough or the legislation quick enough, that what I'm experiencing online will transpire into real life. And it's one of those things now where, you were talking about women walking home with keys in their fingers. Yes, that's outside. But once I've put the key in the door and I'm at home, if I'm not, women don't feel safe in their own home sometimes, even if they do live alone. And that's because of the online harassment that we do face. And there's a lot of women very bravely speaking up about it. So I think, they're amazing to speak up. But unfortunately, things that women like Emily Atack have experienced must never be a thing. And that is not anyone's freedom of speech whatsoever. And, we really have to think about, is your ability to say what you want online worth someone's mental health and well-being and life? I don't think it is and will never be.
I agree. I mean, having the freedom to spread hatred, spread harm, normalise views that cost people their lives. The work we do at Refuge is about saving lives, women taking the brave step to save their own life and get themselves and their children to freedom, to safety and to a better future. Online hatred is a big part of that dynamic. Our sister charity, the Susie Lampley Trust that deals with stalking, have reported now 100% of the cases that they deal with stalking have an online element to them. So this is not contained behaviour in an online world that you can just delete yourself from or switch off. You're right, the repercussions of it are very real in the real world, in people's physical safety and in their mental health and well-being.
Yeah, I recently saw on Instagram about a collaboration with Refuge and the organisation Make It Mandatory. I do follow Make It Mandatory online because I think what they do is amazing. Obviously, unfortunately, the story as to the reason it came about in the first place is really, really tragic and really hard. What kind of inspired that collaboration between the two organisations?
Yeah, so Make It Mandatory are amazing. They inspire me as well, a young survivor-led campaign to say, if we really want to eradicate domestic abuse, we have to educate, and we have to educate young people when they're still in school. So as you go into your very first relationship, how do you know what is healthy and what is normal, what to expect of yourself, what to expect of your partner, what is a normal compromise as part of growing together as two people, and what is actually totally unacceptable. So we reached out to Make It Mandatory actually and said to them, we think what you're doing is amazing. And I'm very aware Refuge has a large voice and a large platform, and we wanted to make that available to them so that they could reach a larger audience really. And we're very proud to be their partner and collaborate with them. I think right at the start, I said, our vision is a world where domestic abuse isn't tolerated. But my day-to-day work is on the front line dealing with survivors who are experiencing domestic abuse right now. Make It Mandatory are doing something right at the heart of my vision. They're saying this is what it takes to eradicate it in society. And at a time when these online misogynists are making their money by spreading hatred in exactly that demographic, this has never been more urgent, really.
Yeah, I think it's like, well, it ties in a little bit to what we were talking about online safety, is that unfortunately the way the algorithm can work, it does push potentially vulnerable men down a very dangerous route where the lack of education about what healthy relationships is or should look like, they learn it from these misogyny influencers. And then that does transpire into, again, having services like Refuge having such high demand. There is Refuge are helping Make It Mandatory lead a campaign by asking people to write to Gillian Keegan. Could you just give a little bit of an overview as to like why you're asking people to write to her and what that letter kind of entails?
Yeah, I mean, it's a relatively simple ask. As the Minister for Education, she can do exactly what they're saying and make it mandatory that everyone in every sixth form in the UK receives education on domestic abuse and specifically on coercive control, so that they can learn their red flags about behaviour, not just from Love Island, which I'm a big fan of, and which is actually where most people are probably getting this information at the moment, through watching an episode and then chatting with family and friends, but actually in school as well, in the classroom where they can be taught and be told, this is a healthy relationship, this is what you need to do, this is what you should be expecting, this is what is not okay, and here are some red flags. If you can learn that in that formative period of your first few relationships, then actually that could make a whole difference to the rest of your life. So the ask of Gillian Keegan is exactly what you'd expect from the campaign name. Please make education on domestic abuse and coercive control mandatory in all sixth forms.
Do you think, I hate always asking like questions like this, but just to like play devil's advocate, do you think that parents have more responsibility to help educate their young children, particularly their young boys, and what healthy relationships should look like?
Yeah, I think it's the parents' responsibility as well. I think they'll do their best, but not everyone grows up in a family where they can have that kind of input necessarily. And I think the healthy conversations that can happen, it's good to put them in as many places as possible. So if they're happening in school too, then that could be counteracting an unhealthy narrative at home, or just speaking into a void, which is going to be essential.
Yeah, I think it's actually really important. I guess like in my household is very traditional. So I never really spoke about these things, and like there's never anywhere to learn about it, especially with PHSE kind of being a subject that's very left behind in schools. So I feel like, you know, when you experience something on a day-to-day basis, you consider that as normal, especially if it's very heavily reflected in media. So like, if for people that do want to help participate and support Refuge with their campaign and make it mandatory, I'll put a link in the bio to be able to send Gillian Keegan a letter as well.
Thank you. I think that will really help. The more people who add their voices, whether you're in school, whether you've got kids in school, whether you just care about this and wish it was there when you were in school, it can make a real difference.
Yeah, definitely. Your comms team kindly told me about you speaking on a panel at Another Way Now event to talk about policing. And obviously we've been heavily talking about misogyny and violence against women and girls in media. Obviously nobody, regardless of how little or much you read the news, can say they've never heard about issues with policing, unfortunately. So do you want to give a little bit of an intro into what that event was about and how you as a Refuge ambassador or ambassador of Refuge would have spoken on the panel?
Sure. So this was the first time we've collaborated with Another Way Now, who we absolutely love. And they are trying deliberately to open these kinds of difficult conversations. I went along because I think it's only when we have these conversations that you're going to shift the norms in society. And if we don't speak out, then the loud voices are the ones who earn the most money, who are the misogynist influencers. So it was a great conversation about what should we do about police-perpetrated domestic abuse, which unfortunately we know is a very big problem. I was invited because on the day that the David Carrick story broke, I did a lot of media, and a few days later we dumped 1,071 rotten apples outside New Scotland Yard to say, we're tired of the kind of reporting we spoke about earlier about these cases, that it's one bad apple or sometimes it's victim blaming. But in this case, lots of narrative that had been coming from the police saying, you know, Wayne Couzens, my goodness, he was a monster. That's not what the police are like. He was a bad un. The reality is there's a systemic problem with misogyny in the Met Police force and in policing. So the event last night was talking about what do we need to see and do to stop this, and how has it got to this stage? How has it got to the stage where as a woman who already knows you may be victim blamed when you report this crime, you now have to get over the fear that the person you're reporting to is himself an abuser.
Do you ever have a closer relationship with police forces, or do police forces ever reach out to Refuge to be able to see what they can do to be better?
Yeah, I am very critical vocally of the police, but we do also have a constructive, positive working relationship with them, including the Met, and they do work with us and brief us. Because we run the UK's National Domestic Abuse Helpline, they will tell us when a very, very significant story is coming, so we can put on extra staff and callers, knowing it will trigger many survivors and that they may contact us for help. So we really appreciate that. And obviously, sometimes when a woman contacts us, the best advice we can give her is to call the police if she's in extreme danger. So I don't want anyone to think that we're saying the police, are all bad apples. The problem is how you tell the difference. And I think that's why one of the things we're calling for is the immediate suspension and investigation of any officer who faces accusations of domestic abuse or sexual offences against women and girls. That's a relatively simple thing to bring in quickly, and it could give a real level of assurance that, of course, this is going to happen. The police is reflective of society and domestic abuse is prevalent in society. But when it happens, that police officer is not going to be someone you are going to have to deal with if you go forward to report a crime.
I don't know if this is actually already taking place, but I'd really like to see a bit more of more strategic and better background checks on people before they sign up to be a police officer. And I don't know if this is ever something that any form of domestic abuse organisation has ever been able to do, but to be able to work with the police, to be able to put that in place as a policy so they don't even have to go to that stage, and they're a bit more proactive about their recruitment process.
Yeah, there is vetting of police officers, but David Carrick is a terrible example. He'd already had allegations of domestic abuse against him before he even applied to be a police officer, and they weren't taken seriously enough. He was re-vetted during the course of his career. He'd had other allegations since then. Again, they weren't taken seriously enough. So there is vetting, but I'm not sure it's fit for purpose, as you say. And I know that that's one of the things the new commissioner has committed to looking at, to strengthen vetting and re-vetting processes.
So I'm aware of Refuge's domestic abuse helpline. I will put the number in the bio as well, just in case that there is anybody that is listening that does need help and support. I actually don't know much about the team themselves or what they do or how they're trained or like how they get there. But obviously we know, especially now with the increase in demand, it's a very important frontline job that they do. So, how does that team come about? Are they strictly volunteers? Are they paid staff?
Yeah, it's a great question. We are very proud to run the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, and it really is the gateway to all services, as well as a place to come, exactly as you said, for advice and support and to be believed and to think through your options. So it's staffed predominantly by volunteers, and then with some trained staff who supervise and are a point of escalation for very high-risk cases. Volunteers go through really rigorous training and have to commit to minimum hours of shifts, so it's not an easy volunteering job, and I have huge admiration for people who give up their time to do this, often on top of full-time jobs as well. They're some of the most empathetic and skilled expert people I've ever met. So they will be there 24 hours a day. Someone will answer if you phone and will listen to you, first and foremost, listen to your questions about, is this okay? What's happening to me? Or if you're phoning in a snatched moment where you can get yourself to safety, we'll help you safety plan immediately and work out what is best for you to do right then and there to get yourself and your children away.
I always assume when you think about calling places like that, is it just somebody, like a whole load of people in an office, or are they in like very individual spaces? Because you don't want other people to hear necessarily what's happening.
Yeah, so the team works in a hybrid way, and we also have a live chat function. So that's particularly helpful for younger women who prefer to type out their questions, and for anyone who it's not safe to speak, they're trapped in a home with their abuser, so they can't phone. The team does work in an office. They've got a bespoke office that's set up as a call centre. And during COVID, we moved to full remote working so that there wasn't any downtime on the helpline. So they can also do shifts from home. So it's a bit of a hybrid. It's a very demanding role, volunteer or paid role, to do from home. If you're in your bedroom or in your lounge and then you come off shift having dealt with very traumatic calls, to then kind of relax, make a cup of tea, watch television, I think that's very difficult. So a lot of people do prefer to work from the office where they've got other people around them, the managers are on call and right there, and you can create a little bit of separation and boundaries in your life.
I think it's really important. I think that's the one thing that a lot of people have learned as a result of the pandemic, to be able to set boundaries. I know at the beginning I was really bad for working in my bed, which is obviously not good for your own mental health, especially if you're dealing with something as intense as that. If somebody was really interested in becoming a volunteer or being able to work with Refuge in that way, what could they expect to be able to do?
So we will advertise when we have volunteer vacancies, and we take and train cohorts of volunteers at once. They can look on our website and see when we have volunteering opportunities open or register to be told. You'd get at least 1 week of very intensive training. It's an amazing training course. I did it myself, explaining to you what is domestic abuse, how does it work, as well as some of the pragmatics of, how to manage your shifts and book in. And then you would start on live chats. So volunteers will start handling live chats so they could be supervised more closely before they would move on to taking live calls, just because of the risk element of the call. If that really is a woman's only few moments to make a call, we need to make sure you're not just trained, but you've had a lot of experience in handling these situations. So it's a phased entry, which reduces the pressure on the volunteer as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the level of support that volunteers may receive from Refuge as well. Because obviously if you are dealing with something that's very high pressured, I can imagine it can be very difficult for the person that's also taking the call just as much for the person calling in the first place.
Yeah, and I think compared to some of the other jobs within Refuge, where it's all paid staff actually, so in the safe houses, the refuges themselves, or in our community outreach, I think the helpline is more tricky because you don't necessarily stay with the woman on her journey. They're a one point of contact service usually, so there will be some calls where someone phones, you support them, you can get them direct access into a refuge, and there's a completion to that story, which, however traumatic it is, at least brings its sense of reward. But often we're a step along the way, and you're not sure what happens to that woman. And it does make those particularly demanding roles, I think. So we have a brilliant and very empathetic and highly, highly qualified staff team who lead the National Domestic Abuse Helpline and who support them.
It's actually really nice. Like, all of the people that I've met that work in Refuge are very empathetic and will literally listen to anything. Even like when I've talked about my own stuff, even if that's not their job, it must be really nice and rewarding to work in that kind of environment where you don't feel worried about opening up to your colleagues, especially when you spend that amount of time at work. I mean, one thing that I always get from people online when I talk about my work with Refuge is that women are not the only victims of domestic abuse. But I always maintained that, obviously, unfortunately, women are more likely to be victims, but that if a man phoned the Refuge helpline, he wouldn't be turned away. He would just be redirected to something that's more suitable for him.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, men do experience domestic abuse. Of course, they deserve support and they need help as well. That's just not what Refuge does. We work with Respect, who are an incredible charity specifically set up to support male victims, so they don't support female victims.
Yeah.
And I think it's far better as charities. We don't solve all the problems in the world. I care about a whole range of issues. I really care about climate change, but Refuge doesn't work on that. So I think I wouldn't want anyone to misinterpret, because we are a charity that supports women and their children, that we don't think men deserve support, that we don't recognise